This is going to be episode 3 of the kitchen sewing table, and as you can see on the table today I have the 1934 Singer 99 as a hand crank. I also have the 1952 1591 under there. It's in its bentwood case. That is an old bath mat that my father used to keep on top of the bentwood case to keep it clean. And one thing I want to note about kitchen table sewing. Now, my grandmother always kept her 99, this 99, on the kitchen table. And in the bentwood case as original, it's about 34 pounds. And I think she kept it there because it was easiest to just leave it on the table instead of moving around. But I have several machines, and I often use a different machine to do a different task. So I have to move them around. And lately I've been working on solutions for moving such a heavy 1591 around. But the point is, part of kitchen table sewing is that you need to be able to clear off the table for dinner. And that's something we need to keep in mind. So the 1591 is probably going to end up on in a cabinet or on another table. And what that does, when you keep one machine at the table at a time, it gives you the rest of the table to lay out your project. Now, this project I'm starting is curtains. Now, this is a slightly different view, and I'm going to explain the curtain pattern I'm doing while I show you the fabric. Now, one of the solutions for moving a heavy machine such as the 1591 is, I wish I had known about these years ago. It's a set of 4 little, they're called trolleys, or they're triangle dollies. And what that's going to allow me to do with the 1591 is I can put these 4 sets of casters underneath my number 40 Singer cabinet, and even if I put the whole bentwood case on top of the cabinet, I can then push it around the room, and it alleviates picking it up and carrying it across the room. So that's one solution for moving machines around. The other thing I want to mention, my mother, that bath mat would not be near the table. My father, you know, it was a clean bath mat that might even have been brand new that he bought because it was the right size or something, and he cut a hole for the handle, but you didn't put bathroom items on the kitchen table. The dog puppet. My mother would never let a dog, anything for a dog, be near the kitchen table. So I'm a little bit wild compared to what they would have gone along with. My grandmother's machine here would be in the bentwood case like fine silverware. So this is kind of, like I said, being a little bit wild with my kitchen table. But I hope tomorrow the trolley things will get here and I'll be able to move this out of the way. And what that's going to do is open up all the space on the table that I'm going to need to lay out the curtains. Now, what I did, I have some fabric, but I chose this time to buy die-cut squares. These are from an eBay seller located in Canada, and very reasonable, $6 for, I think there are 80 squares in there. And the reason I did it that way this time is because I could pick out, this is the brown set, and it's all different browns. This is 40 squares, and then this is the pink set, which is all different pinks. Now, I have 3 windows on the back of this apartment that I'm in now, and I have knitted curtains up, which are not the prettiest. They're not bad, but I knew they were up there because I was moving, and I just wanted something on the windows. So I've gone through a couple of ideas of the type of curtain I want to put on there. what I want is a quilted effect on the windows, both front and back. I'm going to use some blue sheet fabric on the front windows, which will make the knitting is white, the sheets will be blue, and it'll be a reminder of blue sky. But in the back here, where the garden is, I want browns, greens, and pinks. So what I'm going to be doing, and you can do this too, most house windows in this house was built in the late 1970s, are about, the window itself is about 30 inches wide, and with a wooden sill or frame you run into about a 36-inch wide window. So what I'm going to be doing, the first one I'm going to do is greens, because this is March, and for St. Patrick's Day we're going to think of clover in the garden. And it's going to be very simple. There are two ways you can do it. If you do, these are 4.5-inch squares, which will end up being 4 inches each one with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. If you do 8 squares across by 8 squares down, you will get, I think it comes out to 30-inch square patch fabric. Now, what that's going to do, that's like a wall quilt size, which is great, except that's going to go up about 3/4 of the way on the average window. But that is an option. That's also an option if you want to practice making quilts. You can think of it, do 8 across, 8 down, and think of it as a window panel. And so then on the back, instead of knitting, because my knitting that's on the windows is going to be like an insulation layer, I'm probably going to put flannel or muslin on the back of these patch pieces. But if you make an 8 by 8 patchwork fabric and picture it as a window panel, it gives you a real advantage for color placement. Now, if you have the space, you can even clip a piece of flannel to a curtain rod and lay your whole panel out right on that piece of flannel. Use it as a wallboard and stick your fabric on there to get an idea of color placement. And then the easiest way to do that is, once you figure out your color placement, take a row at a time, and this is why you need a clean table. Lay out a row at a time so that as you stitch it, you don't lose your place with where your squares are. So some of this, my laying out of these colors, I'll be doing tomorrow after I can move this machine out of the way. But the other option, and the one that I'm going to do right now, is actually 6 9 patches. I'm going to go up, if you take 4-inch squares and you make a 9 patch, you basically end up with a 12 by 12 9 patch. I'm going to do 3 across, which will come out technically 36 inches, but by the time it's finished it'll be closer to like 30 or 31, maybe 32. I have to measure it all out. And then 2 rows of that. So you only have to make 6 9 patches, and once those are done, you then attach or cut out a matching size piece of fabric of any kind. I think I'm going to use flannel. And then instead of quilting the whole thing, which you can do if you want, I'm going to tie it with a tying quilt method. So at different portions of the 9 patches, I'm going to use either floss or yarn, come through, go down, come up from the back, tie a knot, go to the next one. Usually that's done on the corners of the stitched squares, the pieced squares. So if you want to make a curtain paddle, the first thing to do is decide if you want to do 8 across and 8 down. So 8 times 4 is 32, but you lose 3 inches. I think it'll be 28.5 by 28.5 finished size. And that's 8 squares across and 8 squares down. And then if you want to do 9 patches, 12, it's really, it'll come out probably 29 by 19, roughly 29 by 19. And on my windows here, what that covers is the bottom half of the window. And you can do these in addition to hung curtains. They can either be a winter panel that you just put on for the winter. I want the patchwork quilt effect on my back windows so that in the winter, when there are no plants out there, I can think of a garden with these colors. So the first one is going to be the greens. So the first step is to decide whether you're going to cut out your fabric, and if so, I made a template out of wood, but you can make it out of cardboard to cut out your squares, and then start laying them out either in 9 patches or in the 8 by 8 configuration. And then we're going to stitch them and piece them. Now here's one of the other options for this whole curtain project, is a Singer Model 20. Mine is on this footstool, which again, my mother would never have allowed it on the kitchen table. And I guess I could have put a placemat under it or something. But the beauty of this, with a Model 20 on the footstool I've talked about before, is that you can take it anywhere. You can take it anywhere. A footstool like this is not very expensive, and you can clamp a Model 20 to it and have a little portable sewing table. Now, you may have seen the video on the paper towels that could then be cut up into 4-inch square sections that you could, if you wanted to, use as reusable muslin toilet paper. What I've done is decide that from now on I have a whole bag of little scrap pieces of fabric that whenever I'm starting a new project and I test the tension and the thread on a fabric, I have these little pieces of leftover scraps. I've decided to now use 4-inch squares of muslin. So when this gets filled up with all my test stitching, it can go in the pile that can automatically be reusable toilet paper. It's another way to not be throwing fabric away, especially during COVID, when fabric is probably a little bit more expensive, harder to find, and in more demand. But anyway, here's a Model 20. And this is roughly the size of the curtain squares I'll be working with. 2 layers of muslin is roughly, it's a little bit lighter weight than quilting cottons, but not much. So the one thing about Model 20s is that they prefer dual duty XP thread by Coats or vintage 6-cord thread. I can fiddle with them with other threads, but those are the 2 threads they really like. So at this point, I'm just going to pick out the thread that the machine does well with, and that's why I have some XP on the machine. So I have just done a few stitches in this brown, and I'm checking my tension. And now, if I want to, because this is obviously movable off any table, I can just move this out of the way, clear a little bit of my zigzag stuff out of the way and use this smaller area, which is equal to one place setting at the table, to lay out 9 patch squares. And my point with this is, I like working at my kitchen table with sewing. A lot of people can't do that. People that have families actually do have to clear off the whole table for dinner. I have to clear off about half of the table. But you need to be able to be flexible, but at the same time have enough space where you're working comfortably. So a Model 20, a handheld stitcher like the HandyStitch, the Dexter, or the Sun manual stitchers, or even the imitation Sun manual stitchers that you can get inexpensively on eBay. Any of these, any sewing machine can make these curtains, because you're piecing 2 pieces of fabric together into a row, you know, piece after piece after piece. You only need a 1/4 inch seam allowance to put the whole thing together, and then, you know, all the piecing together, and then you're going to be tying it through a backing fabric. So any of the smaller machines can do that. And then when we get to the edge, you can do 2 things. You can, like if this were a flannel edge and you already had your pieced curtain, you can fold the 2 edges in equally, and probably the HandyStitch and the Model 20 would probably go through that. I'm not sure about the other handhelds. The Dexter might, depending on how you have the tension set and what fabric you're actually using. The smaller Sun handheld may not, because that makes a very tight stitch, and you may not have a lot of leeway with the thickness of the fabric. And of course you can just hand stitch the 2 pieces together on the edge. So you don't need a big machine or a new machine or a fancy machine to make these curtain panels. And what this is also going to show you, as I said before, this is the beginning of making a quilt. If you choose either 8 squares by 8 squares or 3 9 patches, and I have to remeasure them, because one should be slightly bigger than the other, and I'm not sure I had that right. But if you choose either one of these sizes, you make a tall window panel, or you make a half window panel, you then have everything you need to make more of them and sew them together and make a quilt. And that would more be in line with the 8 by 8, which, if it comes out roughly 28 to 30 inches each way, then 2 of them together in a row are 60 inches wide, and 4 of them in a row are maybe the length you need. And you can make 3 across and have a full-size quilt. So this is the beginning of taking, probably for the most part, scrap fabrics, or buying fabric if you can, and or like me, I bought the squares, and using the whole patchwork effect to make curtains, which can then lead to quilts. Now, as I said, I can't move the big machine probably until tomorrow, and I rotate projects. So today I'm spending a certain amount of time on this one, and then I have other things I have to do. But let's start by evaluating the colors. Now these I bought, there should be 80 squares here of greens, and there weren't a lot of photographs when I bought them. And usually when you buy like this, there are going to be some fabrics you love, some that you think are completely ugly, some that you would never use, and more that you love. And what you have to do is you have to back off from what you love or hate and it's like squinting. Um, if you're trying to figure something out and you squint, you get an average. And that's really what you need to do when you get fabric bunches like this. A good rule of thumb, and I'm going to lay out a 9 patch, is light, dark, light. And because this came from a quilter, these might even be like that because she might naturally lay out a light, dark, light. And I don't think there are any duplicates. But what she considers light, I might look at and say, no, that's medium. So I'm just taking the first. Now, here's an example. These two are too close together in tone. If you look at the top row, you have 2 obvious lights and 1 dark, even though the one neon gingham is really neon gingham. You see how if you start to get picky, you're not going to end up with a patchwork effect, you're going to end up with planned color. You can do that. You can buy a yard of blue and a yard of yellow print fabric and do it all yellow and blue. You can do it any way you want, but when you're going with a scrap, kind of a scrap patchwork effect, those 2 rows are fine. But if I add that one to the 3rd row, even though the one above it is an obvious light, this tone is too close to this tone and it creates a blah spot. So when you come across like that, you set that one aside. It just doesn't go there. Now this goes better because the one it connects with is way in the top row. And that will make a better 9 patch. You're going to have to practice with this. Here's another example. Way too close in tone. So in this one, the only thing we have is that neon gingham that's really making this pop out, and we don't want to do that. But here, look at this. This is nice. Now, even though it's a completely different fabric, it's as loud as the neon gingham. Now we have a patchwork effect. So if you're doing 8 across and 8 down, it'll take you a little bit more time to go through this process of really laying them out physically and making sure they go together. Now here's another one that looks like it's a bright, but in this case it's going to pull all the definition over to the right of the block again. It's too bright. We actually want to preserve the wonderfulness of this print. So we want something like stripes. Here are some stripes. So now we have a 9 patch. Now whichever way you're doing these curtain panels, whether it's 3 9 patches across and 2 rows of that, or 8 squares across and 8 squares down, once you get each one laid out like this, then you stitch this one. When I'm doing a big quilt, if I'm doing it in 2 colors, then it's very easy to go ahead at this point and pick up the rows in order and have stacks of squares that need to be stitched. But when you go to the trouble of laying out a 9 patch that you know is going to work, then the time to stitch it is now. And especially in my case, this is why I like 9 patches, because now, if I have enough time today, I can get this 9 patch done, and I've got the first block done for the curtain panels. Now, is it exactly like a green garden? No. But, well, I'm an artist, so I like things differently anyway. But this is an obvious pine garden. I have pine trees. These look like, if I can think of the name of the plant, there's a leaf like that. That's not a geranium, but there's another plant that has a leaf like that and big purple flowers. Midnight in the garden. What do you call it? Pumpkin vines. Picnics. Drawing in the garden. Mud in the garden. And a sunsuit in the garden. Fun in the summer. So when you get this laid out, and you can tell this is just my opinion and my 9 patch, but I like this. And I'm already picking up on things that are going to remind me of my garden. So when you stitch one of these together, or if you do it the other method, the best way to start is at the top row. And you either start here or start there, but you fold this over, stitch this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, bring it back over here, open it up, and then stitch the other side. So you do that with all 3 rows, and then you lay this row up on top of that row and stitch that together. And then do the same down here. After this row is stitched and that row is stitched, you lay this up on top of that with right sides together and stitch this seam. So that's how you make a 9 patch. When you're doing the 8 squares by 8 squares down, you would do the same thing, only with longer rows, but it's put together the same way. So for the curtain panel, the half curtain panel, you need a total of 6 9 patches. And as I said, for the 8 by 8, obviously you would need 64 squares sewn together in this method. And all you need, the only machine you need is, when you have 2 fabrics right sides together, you want a 1/4 inch seam allowance on that seam. When you put the rows together, it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, some of the smaller machines may have trouble going through a seam allowance here because of these seams, but you should, any of the machines I've mentioned should be able to do it. Now let's do one of these seams with the simplest type of machine you can have. These are Dexter Handheld Stitcher and Hemmers. You turn the dial, it says dial a stitch on there. You turn that dial to the right to tighten the tension, and to the left to loosen it. To thread it, you have the thread coming off the back of the spool. It comes down through a hole underneath the spool, and the needle gets threaded from the back to the front. Similar to the HandyStitch and the Sun manual stitchers. But this is how easy this type of sewing is. And an even simpler way of doing it is by hand. So here are 2 pieces put together that we need to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now on this particular version of this, there are 2 versions of this, or maybe 3. The original version has a plain green knob with no letters on it and no thread cutter. And then this one, there's also one with a plain green knob and a thread cutter, and then this, I think, is a 3rd version which has both the dial and the thread cutter. But the thread cutter, and there is a plate that's similar on the other handheld stitchers, is really a guide This part over here, whoops, sorry, is about a 1/4 inch wide, but you have to go a 1/4 inch from the needle. So there's the needle. This back guide is really where you want your fabric. You're going to be able to find reference points like that on any of the little handheld stitchers. So you put this like that, but you need to hold the fabric about even with that black thread cutter. You also want to try to start back here so that you don't have just a loose 1/4 inch at the beginning, but let's just go ahead and start. And the Dexter is one where it's not fed with feed dogs. The others are fed with feed dogs. This you have to do by hand. So this is not going to be neat because I'm behind the camera, reaching down, trying to keep it in the view, and going slowly. Now, before I go any further, I want to see if I can tell how good the tension is. Right under there. And it looks okay. Now the Dexter especially is a little bit difficult to keep straight because there are no feed dogs, like I said. And this fabric is slippery. You can go as slow as you want to get the correct stitch. And don't worry if it's not perfect, because with the chain stitchers you can just pull it all out and do it again. I think someone left a comment saying that their stitches come out crooked, that I haven't been able to answer yet. Don't worry, you're not alone. It's the way things go until you do this. If you sat for 6 or 7 hours a day and did this, your stitches would not be crooked. It takes practice. Now, all of the machines, no matter what sewing machine you have, whether it's lock stitch or chain stitch, is doing basically the same thing. It's holding two pieces of fabric together. Now that tension could be a little bit tighter on this. There's a couple of loose loops, but there is no skipped loops. So there's seam 1. Now, if you're going to top quilt something when you're piecing it like this, and you know you're going to top quilt it, that type of seam matters a little bit less because you're going to be pressing this and then top quilting it. So everything will be held in place a second time. But we're going to be tying this, so we want to make sure that that seam is locked. And if you remember on any of these, you need to make sure that when it breaks, and this one is not doing it, you need that final, oh, it is doing it, but it's very short. You want that final thread to come through the final loop. So I'm going to have to use a little pin and pull that out. And make sure that there is a final tail thread coming through the final loop. So there's our first seam on this 9 patch. And now what I do, you can pin them together if it's easier. The two fabrics weren't shifting with each other. They were just shifting in the machine. So now I put those two pieces together, right sides together, and I'm going to do the same thing there. Now, no matter what machine you're using, that's all you need to do, is a 1/4 inch seam allowance for each 2 pieces of fabric that need to go together, or 2 rows that need to go together. Now I've gone ahead and I've done that second seam. I started here. In this case, it's not going to matter all that much that we have a little bit of space there, because we're going to be tying the quilt together at the corners of the piece squares. I've got the tension a little bit tighter, and this is why with a Dexter especially, you might have to adjust the tension with each fabric. Now this is fine, it's not puckering that much, but it could have. If I had tightened it any more, it would have been puckering. And then down here, the loop became a little bit loose, so it looks like it's going to pull out when it actually isn't. So I'll probably thread that tail right here through this loop and tie it off. Little things like that when you're using a handheld stitcher. So there is our first row of our 9 patch, and you can see how much smaller it is than when we had the fabric laid out. And that's only with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you lose quite a bit, you know, even visually, even though obviously you can tell it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance times 2, so it's an inch. But visually it looks smaller, and it's not pressed right now. When you press it, I find some people press the seams open. I like to press them toward the dark fabric so that they don't show. A lot of times I'm using muslin, and if you press them all in one direction with muslin, it looks neater, because sometimes you can see through muslin when it's wet. But there's the first row. Now we do the same thing with these 2 rows, and then we stitch the rows together, right sides together. And that is the beginning of being able to make patch quilts. Only we're going to make curtains. Now, one slight correction. I said it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance times 2, which is an inch, which obviously it isn't, it's a 1/2 inch. But when you do this all the time, you automatically remember there's also going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance over here. So each square you're losing a 1/2 inch, and overall with this you would lose more than the 1/2 inch right there. And with the 9 patches, so we won't lose that other 1/4 inch until I attach this to another 9 patch. So that's why I misspoke. But you just have to be aware that there are 2 sides, and then a top and a bottom. For each time you're thinking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you have to make sure you account for all of them. Now here's another handheld. Here's the HandyStitch, as seen on TV, the one that I like, and I'm starting the second row. Now the reason, you may wonder, why am I using these little machines? Well, I kind of mentioned it at the beginning. You need to be able to clear off your table for dinner. And if you think that handheld stitchers are really all you need for this project, then that takes about 5 minutes to clear your project off the table for dinner. A Model 20, even if it's clamped to the table, can be clamped at the end of the table where it's not in the way. You don't need to have a full-size sewing machine to do many projects. I made a whole vest with a handheld stitcher. So when I was 12, I made a full-size quilt with a handheld stitcher. So you can use them for a lot of things. But here's the HandyStitch. This is a new HandyStitch, and I'll go over the threading again, although I do have a video up now about doing that. Again, the thread comes off the back side of the bobbin, up through the thread guide, through the 2 tension discs, over to the other side underneath through a thread guide, and then threads from the back to the front of the needle. Now, the battery-operated handhelds are faster and in some ways easier. You can see they also have a plate here instead of a thread cutter, but it's really a guide for how straight you have to go. Now this will be interesting because I forgot to put my glasses on. So I have the fabric lined up with the back edge of the thread guide right there. And we just want to zip right along and just hold the fabric in place as we do this. Now, this is pulling up because of that initial thread, so you may have to stop and get that out of the way. This particular one is brand new. I just opened it. Now, you will notice that my seam allowance is just a little bit skimpy. So, but it's straight. I'm getting better at keeping things straight. With this, you can run right off the fabric and then hold the thread tightly and either pull it to break it so that it doesn't come out of the fabric, or just get a pair of scissors and trim it. And again, make sure that the final thread comes through one of the loops, and I have to fix that one because I didn't pull it to break it. But look at how easy that is to put squares together for our curtains. Now we're at a model 20 for that third row. And so, even though I'm doing this to show you how to do this, I'm also doing this because if I use different machines, even if they're small machines, on my projects, then I'm using all my different skills or creativity or the different aspects that a machine brings to something. You can shift around between small machines especially. And you will find, if you pick up a couple of them, that each one does something a little bit differently or better than the other one. But a Model 20 makes a very nice chain stitch. You get 3 stitch lengths with it. And this one is already threaded. You'll notice that the fabric is also at least a ½ inch behind the needle, because of the way the feed dogs work. Now with a Model 20, you have to take a couple of stitches, and we're going to hope the camera doesn't fall off of the footstool. You take a couple of stitches and then you pull that thread to the back. And I have to hold this still so everything doesn't fall. But it's going to fall anyway. And then just sew. Let me see if I can put this somewhere else and give you a better view. Okay, there we go. Now I actually need this to stay on the footstool, or I would have just clamped it to the table. And I'm holding the footstool between my legs, which happens to be an exercise for me. And the one good thing about the Model 20 is that the right side of the presser foot can act as a 1/4 inch seam guide. Now, when you end a seam on this, you want to pull some extra thread out, and then I use a little seam ripper. Pull it to the right, cut the thread, and then pull this out to the back, and again, make sure that the last tail thread is coming through a loop. So, I mean, the Model 20s, out of the small handheld stitchers, are really probably the easiest with the easiest that has a bed type feed, where you're not, with both the Dexter and the HandyStitch, you have to be able to guide the thread. And that is a little bit easier when you're using a Model 20, or at this point you're on the same functioning level as any big machine. Even though it's making a chain stitch, even though it's small and portable, you're doing it the same way that you would do it with a large lock stitch machine. There are a couple of things that are different, like taking a first stitch or two and then pulling the thread toward the back. Now when it gets stuck like that, it either hit a snag underneath, there's a loose thread here somewhere, and you can pull it, and it'll either keep going or it'll break the thread. But it did just get stuck on something. For some reason it just skipped that area. Now especially if I were using, say, heirloom cottons with like a dauby finish on them, you might run into a snag just because of the fabric. So in this case, I'm going to go back over that one little area. And I think it's this loose thread that got in the way that just... But normally you don't have to do this with a Model 20. Overall, they don't generally skip stitches. If they are skipping stitches, the first thing to check is your tension. So I'm on the inside edge of that, meaning I'm closer to the edge of the fabric than I am the center of the fabric, so that that second little seam doesn't even show up. It will change how I press the fabric open a little bit, but you don't want it to go in further toward the center. So there's a row done with a Model 20. And now we put the 3 rows together and we'll have our first 9 patch. Okay, so after I stitched row 3 with the Model 20, I actually also used the Model 20 to go ahead and stitch those 2 rows together, simply because it was there and needed to be done. And you will notice I did not press the fabric, which is kind of a big no-no, but we're at the Wild Kitchen table, so harder for me to set up the iron than it was to just be careful. And by being careful, you will remember that when I used the HandyStitch, my row 2, the seam allowances were just a touch skimpy. So when I pinned them together, I had to make sure that the corners line up. Now I'm going to show you the same thing. Now when I press this out, it might show that I didn't press it first. It might not. As long as those corners match, then I should be fine. I mean, we're not creating a Rembrandt, we are making kitchen curtains. So what you do, whether you press it or not, it's better to press it. And like I said, I usually press them to the center dark fabric or to the dark fabric. You want to pin these together. Now you see there are 2 seam allowances, one there and one here. To line up the corners exactly, you should have 1 seam allowance going one way and 1 going the other way. Now this is just, it's going to be a little bit off anyway because there's a little bit of extra loose fabric at the end. So you want to make sure you're lining up the stitching with the stitching and have the 2 seam allowances going in opposite directions and put a pin in there. So here's another one. Have one go one way, one go the other way, and make sure that what you're lining up is the actual stitching. And this is why pressing first, it's actually easier to see all of that line up if you press it first. So there we've cheated. We haven't pressed it and we have it pinned. But we can check that by opening it up. And I can see right away that one's off a little bit on the right. So what I have to do, and that's because I don't have the actual stitching lined up. And then in order to keep the ends together, as you stitch the row, you can put a pin in the end too. Now let's open that up again. And now it lines up. So whether you press it or not, you want it to line up. Now what I'm going to do, so now this one seam just needs to be stitched, but you can already see how that will make a 9 patch. And then even though I didn't press it at that point, I would press it from this point on, because if you're off a little bit on these and then don't press it and you're off a little bit differently on the next one, all of a sudden you're off in too many ways. You can only cheat so much before it starts to really show up. So I'm going to sew that final seam, and I think I'm going to end this video now, because this gives you an idea of how to go about and piece fabric squares together to make either 6 9 patches, 3 rows, 2 rows of 3 9 patches, or 8 squares across and 8 squares down. And the next video I make will be attaching it to a backing and tying it. So this is part 1 of the curtains.